Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Rausen Pereira. UN Chief Antonio Guterres on Wednesday defended the UN Human Rights Council and said he would have much preferred for the US to remain in the world body hours after America withdrew from it, citing alleged bias. The decision to pull the US out of the UN Human Rights Council was announced by US Ambassador to the UN Nikki Haley, who also criticized the Council for a disproportionate focus on unending hostility towards Israel. The US has long criticized the Human Rights Council for its standing agenda item 7 on rights violations by all parties in the Palestinian territories. This item was included when the Council's agenda was drawn up at the conclusion of its initial year in 2007, at a time when the US had decided not to participate in the Council. Haley claimed that human rights abusers continue to serve on and be elected by the to the Council. Now, this is not the first time that such a body the US has walked out of in the recent past. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze the ramifications of President Trump's recent actions. Joining me on the program today are Shashank, former Foreign Secretary, KP Nayar, Strategic Analyst, Dilip Sinha, former Vice President, United Nations Human Rights Council, and Professor Pant, Head Strategic Studies, Observer Research Foundation. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Ambassador Sinha, I'd like to begin with you, of course. Let's first try and put into perspective as to what is the role of the UNHRC.
The UNHRC is the main human rights body of the United Nations. It is elected by the UN General Assembly. It has 47 members, and a member can seek re-election only once. So it can have 2 consecutive terms, and then it must take a break of at least 1 year. India has been a member for 2 sessions till recently. It's not currently a member. The Human Rights Council replaced in 2006 the earlier body called the Commission on Human Rights, which had worked in the UN since 1946. And the Commission on Human Rights was scrapped mainly at the insistence of the US because it felt that that body had become very heavily politicized. So the idea of the Human Rights Council was to make it less intrusive, less country-specific, make it more general, make it more promotional. Now, whether it has served this purpose or not, we have to see. But as far as the US is concerned, you must remember, as you just mentioned, that the US did not join the Human Rights Council in 2006 when it was set up. It joined it only in 2009 when President Obama became the US president. Right. In 2006, John Bolton, the current National Security Advisor, was still a prominent figure in the US policy setup, and he was strongly opposed to the Human Rights Council. So that this policy advice really is in line with the policy of John Bolton. That is what the Human Rights Council's record is. And you've just mentioned the standing agenda item 7 on Palestine, which targets Israel, is a factor of, has been a thorn in the US side, has always opposed this, this agenda item, being a permanent fixture of the Human Rights Council. Sure. India also is opposed to this concept of country-specific resolutions. But, of course, we have accepted the Palestinian agenda item.
All right. Let me bring in the other panelists as well now. Mr. Nayar, you know, what powers does the Council possess? What action can it take against those violating human rights?
Well, in reality, the organization has no teeth. I mean, they pass resolutions, but you can ignore the resolutions with impunity, as Israel has done all the time. You know, it's a bit like those reports that the Americans bring out. You know, I mean, in a way, it is hypocritical what Trump has done, because on the one hand, they walk out of this organization, and then on the other hand, they bring out these various reports on human rights. State Department brings out one. There is something called the US Commission on International Religious Freedom, they bring out one. State Department itself brings out something like this. So, but nobody cares about it. In fact, every year when the United States brings out a report on human rights, now China has started bringing out a counter report on human rights in the United States itself. And the United States has a lot to answer for on human rights. I mean, it has the biggest prison population in the world, for example, you know. So it all depends on the country concerned, you know. I mean, you start something against Cuba in these Geneva meetings. Cuba has endured sanctions for 40, 50 years, and Cuba doesn't care, you know. So it all depends on how vulnerable the recipient country is.
Sure, sure. That having been said, Ambassador Shashank, how relevant is the body today then?
Well, human rights is like mother's milk. So everyone wants to have human rights preserved, respected, and that was one of the original ideas of the founders of the United Nations, that not only should United Nations deal with the military issues, but should also deal with the respect for human rights. What has happened is, in the case of the United States, as Mr. Dilip Sinha just now explained, the Americans themselves were against the original body, which has set up Human Rights Commission. So they have this play of bodies in the United Nations. So if they feel that they are not working according to their script, then they would oppose them, they would move out of those bodies, then once again create a new one, so that all the attention remains on structuring and restructuring rather than on the actual issues of content. And what is required is that really we need to have greater respect for human rights, but really it's a question of how you accept it under your own domestic legislations, domestic constitutional provisions, and the kind of political debates at home. In the case of Palestine, it's a very special issue. We had seen that perhaps the Palestinian issue was going towards a resolution by understanding among all the countries by a two-state formulation. But then internally we found that the Palestinians had division of opinion between Hamas and the Al-Fatah and all these other PLO groups. And on the other hand, the Americans decided to move their embassy to Jerusalem, which kind of divided the Europeans and the Americans totally. And they have been doing it again and again. The Americans are very keen now to see that America first is not only as a matter of declaratory principle, but is implemented in each and every international organization, regional body. So this is something very important. We have to see the principles on which the Americans are working on this. So there is a particular objective which they want to achieve.
Right.
And I think while in principle we can say that human rights are good, but the way the organization has been treated, and many of their own officials, they have been working in a manner which is not really very objective. So
sure.
Therefore, we cannot really speak only in favor of this organization or its officials.
You know, talking about the organization itself or the council, you know, it has been strongly criticized for allowing countries with poor human rights record to be a part of it. That having been said, so what is its locus standi really?
Frank, all international organizations, all international bodies ultimately are intrinsically political in nature. So you have the political composition around them that gets reflected in what these bodies tend to do or tend not to do. UN Security Council, for all the lofty ideals that it supports, ultimately is a very, very political body. It takes decisions, countries take decisions based on what their national interest demands. So I think, therefore, to take out UN Human Rights Council as some kind of an exemplar would be wrong on our part as analysts, because ultimately it reflects what the countries sitting there would like to do. And as I think the Ambassador Shashank pointed out, you have countries there which take certain positions, the officials take positions based on very narrow political prisms, very narrow national domains that they come from. And I think that gets reflected in some of these reports, some of these ideas that are often propounded. And it is true that the more open you are, the more vulnerable you become, ironically, because that allows your vulnerabilities to be debated. Whereas the more authoritarian you are, Chinese, Russians, or other authoritarian countries in the Middle East find it almost perfectly all right that their questions are not debated, they are not out on the table, because they don't allow those sorts of conversations to happen in the first place. So I think this dichotomy that we face in terms of how these bodies work universally should allow us to ask certain questions. We have also had our differences with this body in recent weeks.
Yes,
so I think the
have.
larger context in which the body is operating perhaps has been questioned. The question is whether by walking out of this body altogether, America leaves it open for other countries which are even less democratic than America is, or bother even less about human rights than America does, therefore have a field play with this body going forward.
Sure. So, that brings me to my next question, Ambassador Sinha. The US pulling out of the Council, what impact is it going to have on the UNHRC?
When you look at the Human Rights Council, we must distinguish between two organizations. One is the Human Rights Council itself, which has 47 member states as members. And then you have the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which is the OHRC as it's called, headed by Zaid Rad bin Hussein al-Hussein, who is the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Now, the High Commissioner's office, High Commissioner himself is appointed by the Secretary General, not elected by the Human Rights Council, and he appoints his own office. Now, that office is autonomous. It does not report to the Human Rights Council, although it services the Human Rights Council. Now, the Human Rights Council itself has certain procedures which I think are a good improvement upon the earlier commission. And one of the major improvements has been the Universal Periodic Review, which takes place every 4 years for each country. And you'll be surprised that all the countries, including Israel, have gone through 2 cycles of the UPR. India also has gone through, as so as the US. And this is a peer review where the country sends a delegation and it submits a report, and then other countries comment upon it. This is the promotional role of human rights, and I think it has been quite useful for countries. If you look at India's report, for example, some of the points made by various countries are the same points that Indian human rights bodies make. So I think one should treat this with a certain degree of respect. Now, the problem with the US has been that the US has, like most countries, has dual position on this. On the one hand, it is the chief financier of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. As you know, 60% of the funding of the office comes from non-budgetary funds of the UN. It comes from member states' donations, and US is the largest donor to that. So on the one hand, the US is the largest donor to the Office of the High Commissioner and its activities. On the other hand, it is withdrawing from the Human Rights Council because here it gets outnumbered by various other countries which are members and do not have a very good human rights record. But what the US does not seem to appreciate is the larger role that the Human Rights Council plays by making other countries aware of the fact that they have an international image. I'll give you one instance. The Saudi Arabian delegation, during my time when I was there, not only Saudi Arabia, most Arab countries would present women delegates as their representatives of the Human Rights Council. Now, this was an important development to see a Saudi Arabian delegate as a woman delegate, because they realized that it was important to put up a positive face to the world. And this is a factor that the US must consider as a promotional factor. Human rights, no matter what the UN says, is essentially an internal matter of each country. It is for the government of each country to protect the human rights of its people.
Sure.
The UN, all international bodies can only play a promotional role in this.
All right. That having been said, Mr. Nayar, why did the US pull out of the UNHRC? Did Trump's, family separation policy have anything to do with this?
No, the quick answer is John Bolton. John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, he has been always against the United Nations. When he was permanent representative in New York to the UN, he famously said that you chop off the top 6 floors of the 38-story building in Turtle Bay. I mean, and that includes the Secretary General's office because that's on the 38th floor. And he said it will make no difference to the world, This man is congenitally opposed to internationalism and multilateralism. He is a self-declared enemy of the United Nations. So he has obviously influenced Trump, one thing. Second, US has a history of doing this. They pulled out of UNESCO once, I mean, US has no history of working with people who have different points of view, I mean, either you are with us or you are against us. And in the United Nations, it doesn't work. And in any case, on the issue of Israel, it doesn't hold water, I mean, look at Israel's support, in the UN. Usually on a resolution in the General Assembly, only 4 countries vote with Israel. And which are these countries? Not big countries like UK or France or Germany or anybody. Palau, Marshall Islands and all that. So to make it appear that this is an issue that is of global importance is, to put it very mildly, unrealistic.
Right.
And I mean, Dilip talked about the money that the Americans give. It is true that America is the biggest funder of the United Nations, but they don't give the money. Their contribution, until Obama became president and cleared some of the dues, US has been the biggest defaulter. And because of US default, we don't get our money, I mean, our peacekeeping forces are often not paid salaries for months because the Americans don't contribute. So, I mean, this holier than thou attitude by the United States doesn't hold water, in my opinion.
Sure. Ambassador Shashank, looking at the kind of atrocities all around the world, the latest one, of course, being in Yemen, and the catastrophic situation that is just staring us in the face there in Yemen, would you say that we are actually concerned about human rights at the end of the day?
Well, as far as the Americans are concerned, they have a clear-cut view what they want to achieve for the American policies in the Middle East. And they are moving in that direction determinedly. They have really made common cause with the Israelis, with Saudi Arabians and some of the other friends there. So Yemen has become the battleground at this time, where they feel that, well, if it's not Syria, then Yemen, or if both of them together, and then Iran should be brought under tremendous pressure and brought to their heels. Now, this is one way. Second is that always, whenever the Republicans have been in government, they have said that, firstly, the United Nations procedures are very ineffective, very inefficient, and therefore they should not pay so much of money. Because there are 2 parts. One is the compulsory contribution which they have to pay to the main budget of the United Nations, and second one is the voluntary contribution. So main budget also very often they don't pay, and voluntary contributions, as Mr. Nayar said, that in any case they either don't pay or they pay with great amount of delay and then deliberation in the Congress and everywhere in the media. So this is what happens, that they agree to pay, but then they pull back and try to politicize the whole organization much more. So what I feel is that in this particular case, the Americans have perhaps started moving once again under Trump in a direction whereby they will put pressure on the United Nations bodies and simultaneously on the members of the UN by saying that, as Kissinger had said long time ago, the bilateral aid programs and their voting records in the UN will be examined by the State Department, and based on each country's performance, their aid budgets may be changed. So therefore, these small countries which have been paying or which have been playing along with the Americans, they have no way. I mean, they have to go along the same way. And then many of the officials in the United Nations, they know that they are there because there is no objection to them from the Americans. Kofi Annan at one time had declared that the Americans were doing some illegal warfare in the Middle East. He was removed in no time.
Yes.
Boutros Ghali was also punished. So therefore, we find that the present Human Rights Commissioner, he is supposed to be very friendly to the Americans. So perhaps he takes most of his briefs from the American government or American officials. So they are very happy with them. They are not happy with the members of the Human Rights Council. So I think these are things which we have to keep in mind. At the same time, we have to realize that yes, we respect human rights as per the constitutional requirements in India, as per the various internal bodies that we have set up on human rights. We continue to do that. At the same time, if the Americans come and talk to us about many of the aspects, try to put undue pressure on us, we should tell them that yes, there are UN-related obligations which we want to abide by to the extent possible. And so therefore, we will not go along with them.
Sure. So, Professor Pant, what is President Donald Trump's ultimate plan? Is it just that he wants to deliver on the poll promises that he has made? Is he going to become more and more protectionist as the days go by? What is the ultimate plan really?
I don't think it's very difficult to understand, given what he has said. And one by one, he seems to be delivering on many of his promises. If you recall, as was previously mentioned, there have always been two schools of thought in America about United Nations, and conservatives have always been suspicious of the UN and of any kind of international entanglement. And I think that carries forward in some extreme way in the Trump administration, where his argument of America first means that you will roll back NAFTA from the nuclear deal, from NAFTA, from even UNESCO. There is a 1 year sort of a review going on whether they want to be in the UNESCO at the end of the year. We don't know at this point. And they have the first speech that Nikki Haley, American representative to the UN, gave at the UNHRC was pretty lambasting of UN of the High Human Rights Council's record. So I think they were very clear from the very beginning, and I don't think it's holier than thou at all at this point. It's very, very clear, categorical that so far any organization that does not conform to American interests as defined by the Trump administration, they would go and dismantle it, or they would take their cachet and move out of it. Now, the consequences for the multilateral order, as we all know, are very complex. We are all witnessing, we are all grappling with it in multiple ways. But I think the larger, reality in the US has always been this debate, and this is not new. Trump administration magnifies it. But if you recall, this was a debate we have been having, as Mr. Nayar pointed out, during the George W. Bush administration as well, when John Bolton was there. And so whether Americans will renege on their commitments to the UN, whether they will walk out of the UN at all, the whole debate around Iraq war, I think all those exemplify the underlying trends that we have seen in American foreign policy for a long time. And these are not new. What magnifies is the context, I think, one, the Trump administration, and one, the shifting global balance of power. So if America is becoming more and more inward looking, what will other emerging powers do? Whether there is a balance in the system that can create a sort of a multilateral order that we can go forward. I think the trouble is that the other powers, especially the other rising power, China, can be even more problematic on this front. So if you're talking of human rights, China is not the place, and China is not the country that will lead you towards that discussion. So I think for many in the liberal space who want to engage America on this level, the questions are going forward, what are the alternatives, and whether there is even a small space in America now for this kind of conversation to take place, or America has completely gone out of the picture.
Sure. That remains to be seen, of course, and that needs to be discussed as well. Ambassador, closing comments now from all my guests, starting with you, Ambassador Sinha. Like the other panelists have said, this is not the first body organization council that the United States has walked out of. You have the UNESCO, you have the Paris Climate Accord. You also have, the President Donald Trump severely criticizing the WTO time and again. What's likely to happen?
Well, U.S. foreign policy, as we all have, other panelists have mentioned, has always swung between its primary motivation of isolationism, represented by the Monroe Doctrine, and then engagement or domination of the world, as represented by the Truman Doctrine, where they talked about combating communism. And so that swing has always been there in the U.S. Donald Trump, in many respects, represents one of the mainstreams of U.S. foreign policy, which is this foreign policy of isolationism. And he has come at a time when, because of this free trade and WTO system, of which China has taken very undue advantage and created a huge surplus and disrupted the whole trading system because of its trade surpluses. Donald Trump represents that isolationist phase where he wants to restrict America's trade deficit. And then on Israel, we know that Donald Trump is not prepared to compromise. His support for Israel goes all the way to shifting the capital to Jerusalem, and his walking out of the Human Rights Council, as he has himself mentioned, or as the US ambassador has mentioned, is because of the Israel fixation of the Human Rights Council. And that we must recognize is there. Now, Israel has problems of human rights violations, but so do many other countries in the world. I mean, the very country of the Human Rights High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zeid Ra'ad, his own country ranks very low in the Human Rights Index. In fact, it ranks as not free. So in his annual report and his farewell speech to the Human Rights Council, he mentioned a whole list of countries, including the US and India and a number of other countries. But he didn't mention Jordan, his own country, right, where there is very limited freedom. So This is human rights is an issue on which we have to move very gingerly, very carefully. But I think it is important not only to promote human rights within our own country, but also globally through a promotional method. And I think the Human Rights Council is a good step in that direction. And I regret that the US has walked out of it.
Sure. You know, Mr. Nayar, as far as Trump is concerned or the US is concerned, is it going to be Donald Trump versus the rest? Because even the allies seem to be miffed with some of his decisions that he has taken in the recent past.
In the few hours since US announced its withdrawal, I am encouraged by the reactions, you know. So it's not going to be Trump versus the rest, because criticisms are coming out strongly against the US decision. The British Foreign Secretary, and Britain has a special relationship with the US, British Foreign Secretary has strongly criticized the Trump administration's decision. Then the UK ambassador, Karen Pierce, she said in the UN headquarters, especially about Yemen, you know, and Yemen, she said that contrary to a lot that is appearing in the media, she has said that the liberation of the Hodeidah port is essential, because that is the key port through which relief supplies will go, even to the areas that are controlled by the Houthi rebels. And Karen Pierce also made the point, as did others, that Martin Griffiths, the UN representative on Yemen, is making progress. He is in Sana'a discussing the issue. At the end of the day, what does it show? The UN is the only body which can do something in a crisis as in Yemen.
Sure.
So walking out of the UN is negative. I mean, UN has its deficiencies, faults, but without the UN, things could be much worse.
All right. Closing comments from you, Ambassador Shashank. What are the ramifications of the US's decisions going to be?
Well, immediate ramifications will be twofold. One is for the continuing members of the UN Human Rights Council to see, would they be able to fill up the gap of the money that will be lost by the moving away of the United States. Second is, would there be any changes in the priorities and the plans which were being fulfilled by the UN Human Rights Council? So should they now reduce their workload and try to make sure that they are becoming more efficient in their budgeting and in their financial methods?
Sure. And closing comment from you, Professor Pant, as the US closes its purse, Mr. Nayar said that they've never really opened their purse in the first place, but as they close their purse, where does it leave the rest?
See, I think that's a big question, and I think the big picture, given the title of the program, I would say the big picture is that the end of history thesis is completely dead today, and we have seen this gradual progression happening. You know, this idea that liberal values are going to spread around the world, which was propounded at one point at the end of the Cold War. You can see virtually its disintegration piece by piece, and I think the fact that it is coming from America itself shows you how fickle the idea of a single unifying world order can be. And therefore, the question now arises is, where is the alternative model, alternative world order going to come from? And are we in a position, do we have leaders, do we have states who can project that alternative idea? I'm afraid, despite what the Brits, Mr. Nayar is mentioning, or some optimistic thoughts there, I'm afraid we don't see that kind of cohesion in the West. We don't see that kind of leadership in the East. So I think it's going to be very fraught for the next foreseeable future.
You know, Ambassador Shashank, very quickly, since Professor Pant brought up world order, are we seeing a realignment?
The realignment is always very imperceptible, and Chinese know it, that the world order is moving in their direction. The way the Americans have moved out of the South Korean military exercises, though it is only a tentative step because they are carrying out other military exercises, but the fact remains that they want to cut their losses, move out of Asia, and see that they concentrate now on their main area, that is settling the scores with the Iranians in Yemen and elsewhere. So I think they are going to concentrate on that, and this area they will see a little later how to deal with the Chinese and others.
All right, on that note then, we'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's it from me. See you again next time.